So for me, when I start with any form of profiling, I'm ultimately trying to think of what are the performance determinants for success in that sport, first of all. And once I know what those performance determinants are, I can then take a step back and go, right, well, what are the physical qualities that are going to influence or directly enhance those performance determinants that they need for that event?
Okay, Chris Bramah, welcome to VALDCAST.
Mate, thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
For sure. I think we've probably in the last few months we've been working together now, and we've had some really interesting conversations. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity here to share that with the wider Vol audience.
Yeah, I completely agree. We have had some real nice conversation. So I'm looking forward to sort of digging in a bit deeper on some of those topics we've been briefly discussing.
For sure. And so I guess I haven't done this with a lot of guests, and with you, I just want people to really appreciate the breadth and the how wide ranging your experience is. So if you want to give us a 60 seconds or less intro into who Chris Bramah is, and then we'll dive into some specific questions.
Yeah, no, cool. So Chris Bramah, I'm a bit of a mix of all things really. I'm a physio by background. Started my career working in predominantly track and field. Did a bit in rugby league for a few years as well. So have some team sport based experience. But then pivoted a little bit. So I still work as a physio, but I also did a PhD in biomechanics. So where a lot of my career is now, I work at the Manchester Institute of Health and Performance. And one of the big things around what I do is try to use biomechanical principles and tech to really sort of understand, I guess, rehab and injury a little bit more, so we can try and be a bit more specific and detailed about our return to play and sort of rehab management processes. And then alongside that, I'm a researcher. So you'll probably see a lot of papers come out of me over the years looking at, again, how we use biomechanics for clinical purposes.
Amazing. So if we just jump straight into the the interesting stuff, when we talk about running and injury occurrence, injury prevention has been such a topical term. And in my opinion, at least, injury prevention may not be the right term, potentially injury robustness or whatever, but dive into your thoughts on that to start.
Yeah, injury prevention. Injury prevention in itself is definitely not the good term to use, because I think the reality is we can never prevent any injury from occurring. Um, I think there's only one known factor that is ever going to stop you getting an injury, specifically in running, and that is simply just don't run. So the idea of prevention is not really a thing, in my opinion. And specifically, a lot of my work and years of experience have been working with really elite guys. So when you're working at that elite level, or even for most of us, if we just want to engage in 10Ks, park runs on the weekend, one of the primary things that we get encouraged by this sport is seeing our own improvements. And if we want to see those improvements, we're really going to have to push the boundaries of what we do from a training and performance-based perspective. So in my opinion, what that means is we're always going to run a bit of a red line between being safe and staying completely injury-free and finding out what our physical limits are. So I don't really think it's possible in that breath to perform and not get injured at the same time, because you're going to tread that fine line. I think one of the things that we've really should be shifting our focus to is how we reduce the risk of us developing injuries and try and make us all a little bit more robust, so we can cope with that training load that we want, and we can see our performance improvements, at whatever it is, Olympic level, park run level.
For sure. It's multifactorial. I think we can all agree on that. So when we talk about reducing that risk of injury occurring during running, what are the main factors, or what are the big rocks in your opinion, Chris?
Yeah, what are the big rocks? So I quite have like a bit of a simple heuristic in this sort of area, really. And I think this sort of centers around three main domains. And those for me are what I always say to runners is, what you're trying to do is, firstly, you've got to try and train smart. So that involves basically avoiding big sort of sudden spikes, these big boom and bust moments in training. And those are known things that are going to overload the system, potentially trigger injury development. So that's my first one. And my second one is what I'd say to people of, like, recover like a champion. So really that's making sure that we nail our nutrition, our sleep hygiene. Also, it's just the obvious thing of like listening to our body. Like if we listen to those aches, pains, niggles, we can really hopefully prevent them becoming a big thing before they do. And then the final thing is, I always refer to it as, I guess, building robustness or creating a robust chassis to support the engine. Now, that I think is a bit of a simple heuristic. The reality is actually doing that and nailing all of those boxes becomes really complicated and complex. So if I just dig in and pick on building robustness as an example, one of the big questions is, well, what is robustness for a runner? And I think the reality of that is it's really going to depend upon what they are trying to do, what event they're trying to do. It's going to depend on their anatomical structure. It's going to depend on their running style. All of those things are going to influence the stresses, the strains that are going to be applied on their system. And consequently, what we then require for robustness comes to be completely different. So if I take as an example with middle distance runners, one of the big things that we see a lot of Achilles-based tendon issues. So you're going to go, right, for robustness for an athlete, I've got to start profiling and looking around how I enhance that tendon stiffness qualities, plantar flexor muscle endurance qualities, and plantar flexor force production qualities. So for me, then robustness will become different depending on what the event is for that individual. And then the nuances really are then how we test, profile, and condition appropriately to make sure they can withstand those elements of what they're trying to do.
I love that. Love that. So if we take that example, maybe on the Achilles that you just mentioned there, how would you take that with the information and move into the profiling with the technology that you use and the protocols that you use? I'm keen to pick that apart.
Yeah. So for me, I kind of look at like any injury of I've gone and have local factors that are direct to that specific tissue and global factors that are going to influence overall function for that specific individual. So if I'm then profiling around building Achilles robustness for an individual, one of the big things I like using is I like using the 4 steps to look at both gastroc function and soleus function. So I'll do isometric testing using what people might have seen as our kneeling isometric plantar flexor test to get a bit of a bias towards soleus force generating capabilities. I'll also use a standing plantar flexor test to try and integrate both gastroc and soleus into that function. And I'll look locally then on how they are coping at producing high levels of force required for running. So that's the first thing I'd always look at. Then it's knowing that we want them to be able to store and return elastic energy in that tendon complex. So a big thing for me that I've become quite a big fan of is using a counter movement rebound jump, first of all, to just give a measure of like max reactive strength qualities. And specifically how you set that up and how you cue that, for me, will direct where the majority of the contribution to the movement comes for, and then what you are testing within that. So if you simply just cue someone on a rebound jump to just rebound as high as they can, most often they'll shift to like a knee dominant and hip dominant strategy. So you're not really getting a good estimation of like tendon stiffness, reactive strength qualities. But if you cue them to react as fast and as high as possible, we shift more of that load to the ankle. So I like to use that. And then in some instances, I might use like just a 10-5 single leg hop and specifically look at that overall quality of reactive strength from start to finish. So i.e. I'd get like the average of 3 reps and look at what they're doing from a reactive strength index, contact time, jump height perspective. But I also like to qualitatively look at all of those 10 reps and how they're achieving it. Because most often, well, firstly, if you think from a middle distance or endurance running perspective, what you really want them to be able to do is maintain those reactive strength qualities over repeated load cycles, so over and over and over again. And if someone's experienced with that test or knows what you're specifically looking for, you can often find pacing strategies on a hop. So they might start really good, or they might tail off in the middle, and then they might re-get it back together again at the end. So simply looking at the average of 5 or 3, sometimes for me misses a bit of qualitative information about what their actual capacity is to repeatedly sustain those stretch, short, and cycle function. So yeah, I'd like to profile that of the average for the 3, so you get the best, but then qualitatively look at, well, are they maintaining this? And those would be, for me, those local factors that I'd look at. Now, with some individuals, if they move different or depending on what I'm thinking, I might start to go a bit more global. So I might like think if they've ticked those boxes, still have like recurrent Achilles tendon problems, that is then a bit of a sign for me that I'm going to sort of dig in and start looking at proximal segments, sort of gross explosive strength qualities, perhaps sort of seeing if we've got something that is more of a global issue driving that local injury.
Yeah, I've got two kind of maybe sidecars from that. So the first one is the counter movement rebound jump. Great test, and I think the devil is in the detail, the way that you cue it for sure. Because I've seen so many people, and it's basically a repeated counter movement jump. It's not a counter movement rebound jump. But in your opinion, and there's lots of research done on it and everything like that, why the counter movement rebound jump over a traditional drop jump to look at someone's stretch shortening cycle?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. A really good question. And I'll give you the background. I think that originally we started using the counter movement rebound jump as a test that when we were profiling teams, so we had mass numbers coming through on a regular basis, it was the quickest and easiest one for us to use and set up to test mass numbers of people. So that's how we started with it, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, really. And then since then, I really started to dig into what the research was that was coming out around it, started to look at some of the underpinning metrics and see sort of what it gives me more of than a drop jump. And why I've now come to love it is the respect that it allows athletes to demonstrate what their reactive strength qualities are, but it also gives me an idea of how well they can execute a reactive strength task with respect to their maximal explosive strength qualities. So I guess what I mean by that is, if we look at drop jumps and we progressively increase the height that somebody drops from, you eventually find a sweet spot of where their reactive strength lives. And anything beyond that, the eccentric demand as they hit the ground becomes too high, they can't store and return it effectively. So what I like to do is I take someone's max counter movement jump first of all, so I know what their height is. And then I'll actually, once they do the rebound jump, I'll start to look at what the percentage of their max, that first jump, is. And I almost view that as a bit of I guess you could say, a jump deficit. So is somebody able to express their max counter movement capabilities in the first jump, then effectively rebound off it? Or are they a bit apprehensive and therefore know that really they can't handle those eccentric demands of that fall? So they're backing off a bit into that first jump. And if they do that, I might then next go back into that test, cue them to really go for their maximum and see what happens. And often, especially with the sprint guys that I work with, you can see that as their counter movement jump performance increases, we often then get a drop in the reactive strength qualities if you get them to do it towards their maximum. So for me, that's what that allows me to do from a conditioning perspective, is just shift the dial of where I want to focus their conditioning and prevention strategies to. So if they're jumping their max and rebounding really well, still got short ground contact times as they do that, still can attain a high percentage of their max on that last jump as well, I'll go, great. Let's go back to working max strength ballistic qualities so we can move the needle on that dial a little bit more. But if I've got an individual whose jump height is really high and they can't return that force eccentrically, they're then having to spend ages on the ground and can't bounce back off, then automatically I start to think like, right, well, from a performance perspective, let's shift our focus to really developing tendon stiffness, lower limb strength qualities, so you can start to utilize that energy that you can generate a little bit better. Now, look, I don't know if that's a right way to do it. I've had lots of long discussions on this with, some really big people in this particular area, but I found I really quite like it because it does allow me to just shift. Where is my focus going to go? Can somebody handle their actual max force qualities and eccentric force that they can put in from them higher drop heights or not? Um, so it has been very useful for me in that respect.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you just went through there. I think I've seen over the last 3 to 4 years the arbitrary drop jump test, and that standard 30 centimeter box that everyone has access to, and no one can give a real rationale as to why they use it with a 300-pound American football player, and they use the same box with a 185-pound running back or whatever it may be. So having that relative element and falling from your own self-selected height, I think is a huge part. So I'm really glad we dove into that there.
Well, I think it gives you two things as well. Like for me, I'll start by letting the athlete figure out what their own self-selected jump height and drop height is going to be on that jump, and just see where they can get their max reactive strength qualities. And that gives me one thing then, because you think, okay, what's that as a percentage of your max? And then the second thing is, right, let's see how you can handle it if we really ramp up the demands. Um, and it's really simple to conduct as well.
For sure. That's great. Okay, decision making, which is always a tough task when you're working with elite sport. Stakes are high. I came across the SMAS about a year ago. I heard you speak about it at the Sportsmith conference in Manchester last year as well, and really keen to dive into the SMAS model. For anyone who doesn't know about the SMAS, can you give us a bit of a description and how it was developed, and then we'll dive into some specifics.
Yeah, so the Sprint Mechanics Assessment Score is what it basically stands for. What it basically is a qualitative scoring tool that allows you to assess the overall quality of an individual's sprint running mechanics. Has 12 different points, and each of those criteria on there are linked to increasing the stress and or strain that's applied to the hamstring musculature. So the idea is if somebody has a specific feature that is associated with hammy stress, they get 1 point. And we add it up for all of the 12 points. And then that creates an overall score of your movement quality. So the closer you are to 12, the more we can consider your mechanics as being suboptimal. The closer you are to 0, the more we can consider them as being optimal. And it uses really simple, just slow motion video footage as somebody sprints maximally, and you score them against this criteria. Why we created that in the first place is, well, my background is using 3D motion capture. So daily I will use that. And I was consulting for a couple of different clubs at the time. And one of those football-based clubs turned around to me and said, "Hey, this is really great information that you're giving on us and all our players with 3D mocap, and I'd love to be able to bring the whole team up on a bus to Manchester and do this, but that's just not feasible." So considering we have a lot of what we think are sprint-related hamstring injuries, what can you do that can allow us to profile players in field? So that then, obviously went away, came up with the developing of the SMAS score, trialed it for a few different years on different populations, and it grew to what it is now. We took it to sort of try to work the science behind it. So we know we've got it pretty reliable. You've got interclass correlation coefficients of about 0.8. I've recently had a novice rater trial it out and they got about 0.9 and a standard error of measurement of 1 point. So pretty cool. And then what we've done is we conducted it into a big prospective study where we followed around about 127 professional footballers from Premier League right the way down to National League, and had a look to see if those people with higher scores, so worse movement patterns on the SMAS, were at greater risk of sustaining a future hamstring injury. Now, risk is probably the wrong word to use there, but what we did find is the higher scores on the SMAS were associated with prospective hamstring injury development. So it really does support this idea that mechanics are linked to future injury development, and we can assess them in field using a really simple tool. Now, I'm not going to get away from the fact that the tool lacks the granularity that we get from things like 3D motion capture. So it can't give us absolutely everything. It doesn't give us those really fine details, and we do see a lot of other deficits with players that we work with when we use detailed mocap. But it's definitely a really nice way for us to profile players in field, which for me allow you to go, does this player have a movement issue that I might want to address? Or am I pretty confident that their movement patterns are fairly tidy, and therefore I'm going to move away and consider my big rocks, and I might go back to then just looking at qualities like my eccentric hamstring strength, my isometric strength in different positions instead.
That's great. The thing for me that jumps out is like a lot of these systems that I've came across over the years, they basically label athletes, but they don't point you in a direction of, okay, this is where the intervention needs to potentially happen, or this is where the practitioner should explore. So the big question that I have on the SMAS is, with all the potential metrics and the scores that could be achieved from the SMAS, is there any one area or one group of scores that points you towards, more of a red flag than the others, or is it all equally weighted?
Yeah. Within the score itself, we have them all equally weighted, right? But part of the score is comprised of different subdomains. So the characteristics that you'll see within it constitute features of what we might call like lumbar pelvic control. So there's things in there like anterior pelvic tilt, trunk rotation. I'd bucket them into a does somebody have poor lumbar pelvic control category. And then we have other categories that are like backside running mechanics and overstride based running mechanics. So for me, I think when you profile somebody overall, you can then sort of look at where the majority of the features are coming from. Are they coming from one of those three subdomains where you then might want to sort of target your interventions to those specific patterns? Now, what we did do, but never actually published because it just became way too much to put in a paper, is we had a look at amongst those people who got injured in that prospective study, what were the most dominating features that we saw. And the features that stood out the most and most consistently observed in your injured hamstring populations were a thigh separation angle at initial contact. That was pretty much the number one feature we saw the most. So that's characteristic of backside mechanics. And personally, for me, I think that makes sense because it can drive a lot of other features that we see. So big thigh separation angles, increase the length of the hip flexors on that back leg, are associated with driving anterior pelvic tilt. They also then result in placing the hamstring musculature of the lead leg in a longer position. So you're touching down the ground in potentially a position that is also going to drive a little bit of anterior pelvic tilt, put the hammy in a longer length at a time when the ground reaction forces are suddenly rapidly rising. So that was the most dominating feature, which I actually think is also pretty interesting when you think around the narrative that people talk about where swing phase is where all of our injuries occur. Yet the key feature that we saw was a stance phase feature. And I think that's quite interesting because it starts to bring people back to this idea that in team sports, it might not all just be about what we do in the swing phase. And actually, I always think this is an overlooked area, and this concept that swing is everything sort of ignores some of the evidence that stares us in the face. So there was a really nice paper from Noel Pollock a few years ago. And within that paper, one of the bits they didn't really talk about was when any athlete had a hamstring injury, they surveyed them to say, at what time point in the gait cycle did you feel your hamstring injury occur? And I think more than 60% of the athletes, so the track athletes, said they felt it occur during stance phase of running. And what we're seeing as a big feature in stance phase running, that was the most significantly associated with those who went on to get injured. So yeah, there's a few different features in there. And then if I'm to tidy them up, I always think for me, your order of priority when intervening on the SMAS is start with tidying up backside mechanics, because if you correct that, most often with athletes, you will improve lumbar pelvic control and you will reduce the overstride. So I always start with correcting that first. If that doesn't tidy the rest of it up, you then might want to start digging into, well, why have they got an overstride then? And what's driving lumbar pelvic control? And what things am I going to profile around these athletes that might give me an idea of why they're moving in that way? And I think there are lots of really big rocks and big golden wins we can get from combining like your profiling based system using things like I use ForceDex an absolute lot for profiling different physical qualities. So you can get that to really profile and understand why they might move in that particular way. And even, using some of that handheld dynamometers, you can get some nice trunk-based tests done for looking at and profiling lumbar pelvic control too.
This is a stacked conversation. There's lots on here. And more sidecars from me. When we look at the SMAS that you mentioned, you did it in the Premier League and down through the different levels of elite soccer. At VALD, we released the Premier League normative data report a few months back, and in that we actually looked at Championship, League One, League Two, and a few European leagues as well. And we saw some differences in some metrics from the Premier League down, and there was some that discriminated and some that were surprisingly very similar. From your experience with the SMAS, is there a difference as you move down the levels with the scores and with the the hamstring injury probability, let's call it, or is it across the board similar?
Well, interesting, like there wasn't a difference really between those levels, and it is pretty similar across the board. In actual fact, we had like one team that was a National League team in, and they were the only team that didn't have a hamstring injury across that entire cohort in that entire time period. One of the teams with the worst mechanics that we had, I've got to be really careful like what I say so I don't identify who they are, but one of the worst teams with mechanics and injuries was from a higher league team, which for me, it's interesting, but when we subgroup and kind of go, is there a significant difference between those leagues? There wasn't any in their overall scores. I personally think it probably comes down to those clubs where the differences are probably those clubs who have a focus and an attention on trying to develop mechanical qualities will probably move better than those clubs who don't.
Awesome. And then the final SMAS question: have you tried it with any other population? Thinking rugby or anyone else on the team field sport
Well,
area.
me, personally, for me at the moment, I've not trialed it with other sports. Now we have quite a few different projects that have been done by other people where it's now being trying to be used in rugby union and rugby league to sort of see if we're getting the same patterns and the same outputs in those individuals. Track-based athletes, I know there's a few people who have done it, and track's really interesting. So when we designed the SMAS model, a lot of the criteria came from track literature. It specifically came from a lot of Ralph Mann's work in terms of defining what's classed as good, average, or poor. And we took Ralph Mann's poor criteria to help inform the SMAS outputs. So theoretically, unless you're a bad track and field athlete or a bad sprinter, you should move pretty well on the SMAS. So when we have looked at sprinters, they don't really score above 4 points. And I don't actually think especially with your world-class and elite sprinters, I don't think movement quality is something that drives hamstring injury with them individuals. I think it's something completely different, because the reality is, to be the best you can be at track and field, you cannot do that and move badly at the same time. Like, ultimately, high performance in track and field will self-select or require people to adapt their mechanics to move in a way that allows them to apply force more efficiently and run at the maximum capacity. And if you can't do that, you simply don't make it and you don't succeed in track. But in contrast, team sports, the output and the performance requirement that determines success in that event is not your movement patterns and how well you sprint. It's how well you put the ball in the back of the net or how you get it over the other side of a touchline. So consequently, I think the breadth and the variety of movement patterns that we see in team sport have become much bigger than what we'll ever see in track and field.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you've seen it over the last probably 5 to 10 years now. There is a resurgence of track and field coaches working in team field sport, whether that's in the off season with athletes individually or actually being brought into the club to consult and to work on things. So there certainly is merit for that, but it's great to see. Final big topic of this conversation. We spoke about elite professional sport. I'm still struggling if this is a sport or not yet, but HYROX, I want to dive into HYROX because at Vald, at least we've had, such a rapid uptake of requests from our clients that use all of our technology. They're starting to get into the HYROX training space. They're starting to assess athletes. A big question is what do we look at? What are the key metrics? But before we dive into that, do you want to give a bit of a rundown for those who don't know what HYROX is and what the demands of the sports are? What's involved in it?
Me, I'm new to this HYROX game as well in that respect. So, what does it involve? Okay, well, look, HYROX, I guess, is we can class this as like a hybrid fitness style event. So HYROX in itself has multiple different fitness-based exercise stations, which are interspersed with 1 kilometer runs in between. So the idea is you perform an exercise station followed by a K run to the next station, and they will completely vary in what those demands are from those specific stations. So it's been really amazing to see how popular this has gone and how much the take-up has absolutely boomed over the last 5 years. And I think one of the reasons for its success is how different this is to other sports. And I guess that's why we're saying, is this an event or a sport? But ultimately, how different it is to other things, I think, is what's enhanced its popularity. Because it's not just stressing one skill or one physical attribute that other things like running are, is actually challenging athletes to demonstrate max muscle strength capacity, to be able to perform stations like a sled push with a really heavy weight or a sled pull with a really heavy weight. It's challenging muscular endurance with repeated stations like lunge walks, like burpee broad jumps are in there, and wall ball type things. And then it's also looking at challenging our aerobic and anaerobic capacity with the runs and the nature of those stations. So the breadth in the events and the breadth in the demands, in my opinion, I think has driven its popularity, because what it's doing is it's allowing people who have different sporting backgrounds. So it's allowing runners, it's allowing CrossFitters, and even those people who might have just come from general fitness, personal training, to get involved, find bits of the event that they excel at, and therefore be really competitive at. So that's probably what people are absolutely loving about the event. And I think it is cool in that respect. And I know it's probably a bit cliche to say, but it is, if you view it, probably the biggest fitness, all-round fitness challenge event going.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm definitely not speaking per on it. I've given enough of my money and I've done enough races at this stage to do it. It is a tough event for sure. So with practitioners, and as they start to welcome more and more HYROX, offerings into their gyms, their clinics, whatever it may be. If they're let's stick with the healthy athlete first, maybe not the injured athlete. But how do you go about testing? Because I know you've done some work with some HYROX athletes on, let's call it, the elite end of the scale. But I'm just really keen to pick that apart.
Yeah, look, over recently we've done quite a bit of work with varying different HYROXs, so different levels as well. And we've been pretty fortunate to actually get physiology data from and physical profiling data from some of the real top guys. So some of the ones who are like winning the elite event. And to win that elite event is no easy feat anymore, because those guys are fast, they are strong, and they are fit. So it's interesting when we think of then how we go about profiling. And the first time I had some of them in to profile, it was a big thing of like, right, okay, well, what are we going to look at here? Those performance determinants that they need for that event. So it creates a minefield in HYROX, because you think, right, well, it's so broad, there's so many different stations, there's so many different parts to it. Like, how can I profile everything? Well, personally, my opinion is if we start trying to profile athletes on their abilities and the physical qualities to complete the stations, we're just completely wasting our time. And the reason is because each of those stations demands completely different physical attributes. And therefore, profiling a station is only going to give you a really, really small influence or small snippet on what's going to impact their overall performance. However, the one consistent theme within HYROX is running. So that's comprising about 50% of their event. So for me, I think where then I've tried to direct a lot of my attention to is think like, right, well, I've spent years profiling elite endurance athletes, and considering elite endurance athletes rep out kilometer reps for breakfast, and they'll do it in like 3 minutes per K. Some guys will do it even faster. Let's have a look at how HYROXs compare, knowing that that is the mainstay of their performance. And then for me, it's go, okay, well, what's the performance determinant to be good at a K rep? And it's how economical you can be at your running. And running economy is going to be influenced by form, first of all. And then it's going to be influenced by reactive strength qualities and our ability to store and return energy within tendons. The better we can do that, the more economical, the easier those K reps are going to be for those HYROX guys. And I think a lot of those athletes are actually really recognizing the importance of enhancing their running ability. So it's been interesting to profile them using, like, plantar flexor force testing is one thing I've used, because that plantar flexors are our main contributor to enhancing our stride length when we run, and also will directly influence how much energy and force we can put within that Achilles tendon. And then looking at their reactive strength qualities. And if we consider some of these guys are incredibly fit, their actual plantar flexor function and reactive strength qualities are terrible. And and they're moving fast and they're competing at a really high level, but compared to an endurance runner, they've got really big scope to be enhancing certain qualities within that direction. And then in reflection, I think that kind of makes sense for me, because if you look at the training they do for HYROX, it's largely geared around getting good at those stations, which is like strength-based work of moderate intensities or moderate loads repeated over and over and over again. And if we look at tendon adaptation, we know tendons don't get stiffer or adapt unless you put somewhat above 80% of your max force into that task. So the actual training for the HYROX event is not really giving the guys the physical attributes that could make them a really good runner in at the same time. So profiling that has been really interesting to see, because I think then we've got some really easy rocks that these guys can then enhance, develop, and is going to have a big impact on their ability to be economical in that run. It's 50% of that competition, and that's going to change the times that they can do and whether or not they're recovering in between. So that's where I've directed a lot of my attention to, and I do think that's probably going to give us some really big rocks, you know?
For sure. So if we recap the tests, the plantar flexion, is that on force decks in the kneeling variation, or is it a force frame variation, or does it matter?
Yeah, so I go force decks. So I use my kneeling variation first of all. I do that on the force decks with an isometric rig setup. Now I know lots of other guys have done the same test in position using the force frame. So the force frame is a really nice one that you could also combine and use for that. Not that I should probably give you this, but most people talk about it anyway. Generally, I look for elite endurance guys hitting anywhere between 1.9 and 2.2 times body weight on that test. So they should be able to generate big force production there. That's the one I go to, and that's the one I think is the most important. I might add in other additional ones, so like a standing plantar flexor test again, using force decks for that. But I don't think is as essential at this moment in time for those guys. I think kneeling will give you those wins. And then the reactive strength qualities are what I'm thinking using that rebound jump. I guess other areas where I've noticed obvious weaknesses are around hip abductor muscle force. So if you use force frame for profiling hip abductors, they tend to be a lot lower again in HYROX guys. And from just a historical lesson of learning is that when we look at injured endurance athletes, the two commonalities that we tend to pick up and see are poor hip abductor muscle function and poor plantar flexor muscle function. They're like two rocks over years that you just consistently see time and time again. And when I've looked at abductor muscle function, again in HYROX guys, you do see it a lot lower than what your endurance guys would be trying to attain. So I think there's scope there from an injury prevention standpoint to improve that, and would also theoretically start to enhance exercises such as your, I guess, like your walking lunges for stability purposes.
For sure. Have you looked at anything with regards to like the effect of fatigue on running mechanics or on some of those profiling metrics?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not like a massive fan, or I don't massively see the need for me to profile how fatigue changes some of the metrics. And I, there's elements to that. The first one is the reason why I don't necessarily think I need to do that. And comes from looking at some of the endurance running work that Rich Blygrove has published over the years. Now, Rich published a study a few years back now where he looked at how plyometric and strength training influenced running economy in marathon runners. And what they found is that those people who engage in a course of strength and plyometric activity, so improve those max strength and reactive strength qualities, their running economy was more resilient to fatigue at the end of a race. So as they got further into the marathon, they could maintain running economy. So we kind of know that actually your ability within a fresh state will also influence how you function when you are under fatigue and give you greater capacity to function under fatigue. So that's one reason why I've not necessarily gone too much about it. There is the other element of where I see its potential benefit, because I'll test some guys I work with on a weekly basis, and we can see fluctuations in their neuromuscular performance on a counter movement jump, for example, where either jump height will tail off or contraction time will increase. So we know that they're taking a longer amount of time to produce the force to jump, for example. Now that for me is a really nice sign of potential neuromuscular fatigue. So I think there is potentially some merit in looking at how individuals change from a fresh state to a fatigue state, but on those similar metrics. So it's kind of then looking at, right, well, actually, as you fatigue, are your phase durations like increasing, or are you able to still maintain fast contraction times? because for me, that would be really pivotal for, we run an economy at the latter stages of a race. I think the biggest challenge, though, when we do this is how we standardize what fatigue is and how we actually monitor what fatigue is in that first instance. Because what if we just simply use runs or simulated workouts, what they are experiencing physiologically compared to somebody else are distinctly different, and what they are experiencing physiologically compared to what they do in the event is also going to be distinctly different. So my bias of why I don't like to do it is more the standardization of what I'm actually testing, which I know I'm nailing in that sort of fresh state.
Yeah, I love that. It brings me to a bit of a quick story on. I spoke to Dan Cohen on this, and this concept of fatigue testing and protocols to elicit fatigue, and then you test them at the start, you test them at the end, and you do it with a team, and they come to you and they look at the data, and there's nothing jumping out. There's no significant differences, and they're like, Where is the fatigue?" But sometimes you don't need, if you don't have fatigue, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It could be a positive indication of the state or the capacity of those athletes. So I think with HYROX, the narrative that I've seen, at least in Canada here and in North America, is you're operating under fatigue, throughout for the average person throughout the whole event. So the testing mindset might be to, let's fatigue them and let's see how they handle that fatigue. But it's a really interesting,
Yeah.
pushback almost from you there.
Yeah, it's an interesting concept, right? The fundamental thing on HYROX, if we look at those studies that have been done around what the physiology of that is the majority of HYROXs are competing at and sustaining heart rates of about 80% of their maximum across the entire event, and blood lactate volumes of about 6 to 7 millimoles. So I'm not necessarily going to say they're functioning in fatigue. I think that for the whole event, they are functioning close to their upper limits of what they are capable of achieving. And the reality then is that technical ability, pacing, and being as economical as you can within those runs become essential. Because if you mess up your technique and try to muscle it, or you're not economical within the run and try to force it, you're very quickly going to tip your heart rates a bit higher than that 80%. Your blood lactates that little bit higher, to a point where you actually won't recover from that. And then consequently, the subsequent station is completely compromised. And then that person, I'm not going to say is like trying to do an event with fatigue. I'm going to say that person's trying to get themselves out of a hole because they messed it up earlier on. And ultimately, it's very, very similar to what middle distance guys have to cope with. If you look at that 1,500-meter runners, in particular, when you watch them run the Olympics, they are functioning close to their maximal limits the whole time. And if they put in too much of a surge earlier on in that race, spike the heart rates and blood lactates, a lot of them won't come back out of it. So HYROX isn't different in that respect. You're trying to develop the same physical qualities that those endurance guys are. And if they can be really economical and fast at those K reps in between, what you might actually start to find is that becomes a little bit of a recovery for them in between the stations. And I know those physiological studies, the data doesn't change much, but you do see in some of those guys an ever so subtle reduction in heart rate and reduction in blood lactates in the run bit. And that for me just highlights the importance of like, right, well, if you can maintain tendon stiffness, if you can maintain your movement patterns and run it economically fast, you can perhaps buy yourself that small, hopeful chance that you'll recover a little bit before you hit that next station. But I don't think it's not a fatigue-based event, in my opinion. It's a how long can you sustain your max capacity for? And that's what every event is. If you're 100 meters, how long can you sustain your max before you slow down? If you're a marathon runner, how long can you sustain your max before you slow down? It's the same in this. Every sport has fatigue, but this event in itself is just forcing you to be at the upper limits of your max capabilities from the moment you start it.
Yeah, that's a great way to end the HYROX discussion. I think that's really, really good, really practically applicable information there as well for practitioners. So I'm sure you'll have people reaching out after this with some HYROX specific questions, Chris. But this brings me to close it out. I've got two quick fire questions for you, and I like to throw random questions at people at the end with no prompting. But let's just put you in a scenario where you're walking into an elite performance environment and you have to answer as many relevant questions about the capacity, the state of athletes, but they've told you you're only allowed to bring one piece of technology. What do you bring and why?
Easy. Force decks. I'm always going to bring force decks because it's so versatile. People will see that I'll use jump test, I'll use hop test, I'll use isometric test. I can do isometric test in different positions. I can get plantar flexors, I can get hamstrings, hammies in multiple different ways. I can get rapid force, I can get peak force. It's the one bit of kit that is insanely versatile for me if you know what you're using and what metrics you want to look at.
Love that. And then the final one, you're in an interesting position where you work with elite athletes, but you're also involved in the academic scene where you're dealing with, the future graduates and the next big players in our industry potentially. What would you advise as, emerging trends, or what students and what practitioners should be upskilling themselves towards moving forward for the next 5 to 10 years? What's coming, or what's important and overlooked right now?
Oh, I think what's coming, everybody's gonna say the same thing here, is that AI is coming. Um, and what I generally say to, I can be a bit brutal sometimes to some of the students that I work with. And I think the reality is it's a scary future with AI. And if we are not careful, AI will replace us in our jobs and in our beings. And how we avoid that happening is making sure that we stay creative in our minds, we stay critical in our minds, and we understand how to use it effectively to support what we do, but also we are critical of AI, because one of the big, I guess, pitfalls I see at the moment is lots of people are jumping on it thinking it will give us all of the answers. But the reality is it lies. So I've had conversations with ChatGPT and asked it, are you lying to me? And one, it's got aggressive with me in the past. So that was interesting. And two, it has admitted that it will lie. So you got to be aware of that. And then everybody's trying to develop like crazy AI technology to like be a cheaper version, an app that you can get on your phone that'll look at your mechanics or will look at your jump heights, etc., using AI. But the reality is these things haven't been validated. They have not been tested and trialed out in the way that current equipment, your current force decks, your node board systems, it's not been trialed out in the way that these things have. And therefore, we've got to maintain that critical mindset of like, actually, what are we interpreting here and what is this giving us? And if we don't maintain that, we will be replaced. It's simple as that. So
Love that.
sorry,
That is
end that one on. You ended me with a doom and gloom statement there. I feel like that
uh,
was a bit of a setup.
that's the longest answer to a quick fire question, I think, in the history of podcasts. So it's great.
Oh,
Uh,
mate, I could go on. I could go on.
you're all good. You're all good. So, Chris, I guess final point. If people want to reach out and connect with you, where's the best spot to do that?
Yeah, I'm fairly active on social media. Not necessarily X anymore, but probably more Instagram. So my handle is at Chris Bramah. Getting pretty active on LinkedIn. So I tend to try to reply as best as I can to like messages and comments that get put out there. If you email me, there's a strong likelihood I won't reply, because it'll just get buried in a million and one emails. So I do apologize. It's not me being rude. Life just gets hectic, but social media is probably a nice one I like to engage on.
That's great, Chris. Well, thank you so much for your time and for this conversation.
No, thanks for having me.
Awesome. And to our listeners, please continue to like, subscribe, and share VALDCAST wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back very, very soon.